15.5 Central Nervous System, the brain. This diagram represents a mid-sagittal section. If we cut the brain right on the midline into equal right and left sides, we would get this sagittal section. We can use this to first identify the major parts of the brain, and then we'll assign some specific function to these. The uppermost portion of the brain is the cerebrum, all of the ridges and convoluted structure you see at the top. If we move down deeper, in the middle of the brain there is an area called the diencephalon. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, which is right in the center, and the hypothalamus. And then if we continue to move down, we get to the brainstem. The brainstem is a collective term for the midbrain, the pons, which is the bulge area there, and then the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest portion of the brain. And then back in the back lower portion is the cerebellum. There are also three membranous coverings around the brain. These are called the meninges. The one closest to the cranial bones would be the dura mater. Beneath the dura mater is the arachnoid, and then the third layer is a very fine, delicate layer that's right down against the brain. This is called the pia mater. There are also 12 pairs of cranial nerves that directly enter or exit the bottom of the brain. The cerebrum, we can consider this to be the executive suite of the nervous system. It is divided into right and left hemispheres. This is where thought processes occur, learning. This is where we store memories, and also where we have the final conscious integration of sensory input. So if we are aware of sensory input, pain, temperature, touch, vibration, any of these things, it is because that signal arrives up at a very specific location in the cerebrum. And this is also where we initiate motor commands to skeletal muscles. In this diagram we can see some more detail of the cerebrum. It is divided into separate lobes. The frontal lobe, which is in the front, right underneath the forehead. If we go towards the back of the brain, the upper portion is the parietal lobe. There's one frontal lobe. There are two parietal lobes. And then way down at the bottom in the back is the occipital lobe. And then along the sides we have the temporal lobe. This diagram also does show us that there are some specialized tasks that are performed in specific areas of the brain. So for example, the frontal lobe, this is where a lot of our conscious thought processes occur. A lot of personality is thought to reside in the frontal lobe. Initiation of speech is in an area of the frontal lobe. If we come, for example, to the temporal lobe, this is where some of the processing of auditory input occurs. Also some speech processing occurs in the temporal lobe. The occipital lobe, back in the back, is where visual input is processed. And then the parietal lobe processes sensory input. There's a very important area, the central sulcus. The sulcus is the depression, and this separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. That first area in the parietal lobe is called the primary somatosensory area, and there's really a map of the human body right there on that lobe, and this is where consciousness of sensory input from the skin arrives. So any sensory input originating such as pain or temperature or touch or vibration is sent along a chain of neurons and finally arrives in this primary somatosensory area. In blue, that very last portion of the frontal lobe is called the primary motor area. And this is where we initiate motor commands to contract skeletal muscle. The diencephalon, which is below the cerebrum, contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is a relay station for all of that sensory input. All sensory input, with the exception of smell, goes through the thalamus, and it can edit that information, process that information, and then only a fraction of that is actually sent up to that primary somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum. The hypothalamus is a major integration center for autonomic mechanisms. Regulates things like temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep, and also the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, which is the master endocrine gland. Below the diencephalon is the brainstem. This again is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Much of this portion of the brain contains axon fiber tracts connecting upper portions of the brain with the spinal cord. So this would be those incoming sensory tracts going through the thalamus, eventually up to the parietal lobe. Also those motor tracts that initiate in the primary motor cortex and eventually have to pass down through the brainstem and the spinal cord. There are some reflex centers, and these are some small areas of gray matter. Those would be the neuron cell bodies. So these reflex centers are also distributed throughout the brainstem, and they control things like our visual reflexes, auditory responses, also heart rate, and respiratory rate is controlled by some of these reflex centers in the brainstem. Another one would be blood pressure controls are monitored in the brainstem. So the brainstem, these control centers control just very basic autonomic. Whenever you see the word autonomic, think automatic. So these are things that kind of run in the background of the computer, things that we don't have to consciously control. These are just basic survival mechanisms. So these can be regulated by the brain stem without any input from higher brain regions. Higher brain regions, such as the cerebrum, can override these at times, but they do not need any cerebral input for some of these basic survival mechanisms to function. This is why individuals can be what we call brain dead. There's no consciousness. Consciousness, thought, memory, personality, all of these things occur in the cerebrum. There can be no cerebral function, and the brainstem will still keep the heart going, respiratory system going, digestive system going, and so forth. The cerebellum, back in the back of the brain, is responsible for coordination. The cerebellum will monitor all incoming sensory information, including that about body position, balance, equilibrium, and it also monitors outgoing motor commands, and so it really compares to make sure that we're doing what the brain intends for us to do. So in order to have posture, balance, any type of coordinated muscle movement, the cerebellum constantly is having to keep up with body position, muscle tension, joint position, gravity, all of these different things so that we can have coordinated activity. There are some specialized neurons in the cerebellum that synapse with over 20,000 other neurons. That's a pretty big family and friends plan. So if you recall this segment about synaptic communication, we saw a picture of a cell that was just absolutely covered with axon bulbs. All of these other neurons communicating with it. There are also some functional systems in the brain, and so this isn't a specific area. These systems consist of a series of neurons that are located in different areas of the brain, but they function together to accomplish a specific purpose. One of these is called the reticular formation. The reticular formation keeps the cerebrum alert, so it maintains wakefulness by constantly sending messages, stimuli, to the cerebrum. Another system is called the limbic system. The limbic system is our emotional brain, and so it coordinates emotion and higher thought processes, and so the limbic system is very active whenever we are experiencing times of emotion, pleasure, pain, sadness, love. All of these involve activity of the limbic system. There are several degenerative brain disorders that you would commonly hear about, unfortunately. One of these is Alzheimer's disease. Basically what happens in Alzheimer's disease, there is a faulty protein metabolism. There is a protein that misfolds, and as it misfolds, these proteins aggregate and they form a plaque. It's called a beta amyloid plaque. And these will form around axons, and it'll kill the axon. And so what happens in Alzheimer's, very sad, is these neurons die. There's just a progressive loss of mental function. Very slow degeneration of the nervous system. Another one that you commonly hear about is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease results in a loss of motor coordination. The reason for this is there's not enough of a specific neurotransmitter, dopamine. Dopamine is secreted by some basal nuclei that are deep in the midbrain area. And what dopamine does is it prevents skeletal muscles from fighting one another. Skeletal muscles, we'll learn in one of our next lessons, skeletal muscles function in pairs. So as one skeletal muscle is contracting, it's being stimulated. There's an antagonistic muscle that has to be inhibited and relax. And this is where dopamine functions. So if there is not enough dopamine, it's difficult to inhibit one muscle so that the opposing muscle can contract. This is what results in the involuntary tremors, loss of muscle coordination in Parkinson's patients.